And that's going to occupy the last two sections of my talk. All right, next, please. So what is my thesis? Well, very simply, I think that there is an important mandate for climate care that has often not been given due attention in the church. And here I'm going to refer to that well-known petition found in the Lord's Prayer, which many of us say Sunday by Sunday. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And tonight I'm going to try and explore the meaning of this petition in terms of the messianic hope. Because biblical religions such as Judaism and Christianity have always looked forward to a time when God will transform the world so that it more closely conforms to the divine will and reality. And I think that the Lord's Prayer shows that this hope for the future is also a mandate for the present. To hope for the coming messianic kingdom is to work for and manifest signs of it in the here and now. In other words, God remains at home in this world, and this world, therefore, is also our home. Next, please. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what can that mean? And how can it interfere or interface with a concern for climate care and the current environmental crisis? Well, any attempt to explain this petition has to recognize the fact that there's a certain ambiguity about its meaning. In fact, it seems to have both a present and also a future reference. On the one hand, it reflects an early Christian belief that looked forward to a time when the moment of salvation that began with the birth of Jesus would reach its fulfillment. Now, there are various ways of thinking about this crucial doctrine about the future action of God, but tonight I'm going to refer to it as the messianic hope. As you're probably aware, there was a strong belief in the Jewish matrix that gave birth to the Christian church that God was going to renew the created order. And often it was thought that this action of God was going to be accomplished by a kind of divinely chosen agent called the Messiah, or as that word came to be translated into Greek, the Christ. The result of the Messiah's role would be the inauguration of a new era in human history. And that era, that new time in history, was identified with the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. And the early church identified Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ through his incarnation as a human being, through his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. The early church believed that with the coming of Jesus, God had inaugurated that new era into the history of salvation. And that era would end with ultimate victory over sin and death in God's new heaven and new earth. So the messianic hope helps us to understand the meanings of the prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In fact, there are two different ways of understanding this part of the Lord's Prayer. And one of them we can call the apocalyptic dimension of the Lord's Prayer. According to this apocalyptic interpretation, when the church prays your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, the hope is that God's going to inaugurate that coming reign of grace by fully realizing the messianic hope. It earnestly asks God to bring into being a new heaven and a new earth. And yet at the same time, the prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, also seems to be aimed at expressing an unethical agenda for the present. After all, this is the prayer of Jesus. He embodied the messianic hope, and he called on his disciples to do the same. For that reason, if God's will is to be done on earth, then the followers of Jesus have something to do to implement God's plan in the world as it is. And I think proof of that can be found in the context in which Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer appears. Remember that the Lord's Prayer is part of the instructions that Jesus is said to have given his disciples on the Sermon on the Mount. Teachings about anger and forgiveness were certainly intended to be carried out in the here and now. Therefore, the petitions, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," can also be understood as prayers for the grace, for the guidance necessary to carry out God's will in the present world. Next slide, please. So there's a certain ambiguity in this petition from the Lord's Prayer. And the problem for us in the church as Christians, as believing people, is whether the future reference dominates and discounts the ethical reference in the present. Or to put that dilemma in another way, let me ask this question. To what degree is the Messianic era continuous with the present creation? And to what degree is it discontinuous with the present creation? Next, please. Now, if we're going to answer that question, we have to come to grips with the fact that not everybody in the church puts the accent on the same syllable. There's a substantial constituency, certainly in North American Christianity, that says that the environmental crisis is not something that followers of Jesus should be especially concerned about. This form of Christian thought imagines that the new world the New Testament hopes for stands in opposition to and in discontinuity with creation as it is now. Next, please. So for such thinkers, the apocalyptic dimension of the messianic hope overwhelms all other considerations. In other words, there's an opinion in certain parts of the church that this world is not our home. And for lack of a better term, we can call this perspective heavenism. Next, please. After all, isn't the Christian hope to live with Christ forever in death in heaven? Isn't this present world one, therefore, that those who follow Jesus want to escape from or be rescued from? These are not idle questions, and they certainly have some degree of support in the scriptural witness. Next, please. For example, doesn't St. Paul say, we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord? Next. Don't we learn from the first letter of John, do not love the world or the things of the world? Next. And last, but certainly not least, such a world-denying spirituality finds expression in many popular hymns. Probably one of the most familiar examples comes from a hymn written in the early 20th century. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. So is this world our home or isn't it? Is the Christian hope predicated on the belief that God's ultimate intention is to abandon the present creation altogether in favor of a new era in the history of salvation? Now, those Christians who are attracted by the concept of heavenism can point to various biblical texts which suggest that God is going to give up on the present dispensation. Next. Here's a passage, for example, from 2 Peter. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire. And the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in leading lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set ablaze and dissolved, and the elements will melt with fire. But in accordance with his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth where righteousness is at home. Next, please. So the upshot of this particular exegetical trajectory is represented by statements like this that I pulled from the internet a little while ago. Quote, a Christian must remember that God is in control and that this world is not our home. God will one day erase this current universe and replace it with the new heavens and new earth. How much effort should be made saving a planet that God is eventually going to obliterate and replace with a planet so amazing and wonderful that the current earth pales in comparison? Next. Well, Christians who think this way are certainly not going to be moved, even when, as we learned earlier this summer, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change declared the current environmental crisis a code red for humanity. Now, I'm not interested in vilifying anybody here. Many exponents of what I have called heavenism are trying their best to be sincere followers of Christ. However, I do want to represent another perspective this evening, one that claims that this world is our home and that it is God's intention that it remain our home. And that's true, even if we look forward to some kind of transformative action of God that leads to the experience of a new heaven and new earth. In other words, I think the exponents of heavenism have misunderstood the full dimensions of the messianic hope. Next. And to me, that's apparent even in a dramatic text like 2 Peter. If you look at it closely, for all of its destructive imagery, there's no claim that Christians have nothing to do in the presence. On the contrary, the call is to lead lives of holiness and godliness. Next. Moreover, what can it mean to hasten the day of the Lord if there is not some part of the Messiah's mission that the church has to carry out in this world? And in answering those questions, I want to place a particular emphasis on the context or the concept of godliness. Now, presumably, to be godly means to reflect God's own relationship with the world. And in this case, there's abundant evidence in the Bible that God loves the world and its creatures. Even if God's ultimate hope is to transform the created order, that transformative action is directed towards a created order that God remains committed to. And that's because, as we will see, the world as it now is a world that biblical thinkers see and saw as capable of revealing the divine presence in time and space. Next. In fact, there are many indications in the Bible that God is committed to the created order. The most important evidence for this is the concept that Christians call the incarnation. Notice how in this Renaissance painting, the only source of life is the child. From the perspective of the Christian gospel, the saving action of God did not begin on the cross or at the empty tomb, nor even with the ministry of Jesus. It began with the firstborn son of Mary. As St. Paul says, for it is the God who said, let light shine out of the darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Next. In other words, the messianic hope is revealed in the present created order. That same message comes from the parables of Jesus, but it also appears elsewhere in the biblical tradition. And there are many references, especially in the book of Psalms, that depict the created order as it now is, as having a capacity to respond positively to God's saving actions in this world. Next. And here's just one example. In Isaiah 55, the prophet's anticipating that Israel's exile is about to come to an end. This event is so momentous, so significant in the history of the world. Next, that even nature will respond in joy. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Elsewhere, we read of the sea and the waves responding in a roar of praise for the Creator. Next. Secondly, the created order also has a prophetic role, according to biblical thought. If creation suffers under the judgment of God, that judgment is first of all directed towards human infidelity. Indeed, the misery of the earth is a prophetic sign of God's displeasure with the human community, as we find, for example, in this text from Isaiah chapter 24. Next. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Could we not also ask ourselves today to what extent the earth is suffering because of human infidelity? Next. Well, another indication of the revelatory aspect of the created order appears in the teachings of Jesus. The Gospels are remarkable, in fact, for the number of parables in which Jesus used natural phenomena as signs of the presence of God or of the actions of God in the world. Most importantly, for our purposes, the parables reveal the created order in its present form as a vital forum in which the divine reality that Jesus called the kingdom of God was and is discernible. We can see that revelatory aspect at nature at work, for example, in the parables about the tares among the wheat, or the action of yeast in a lump of dough. The mystery of growth itself, according to Jesus, points to a truth about how God works in the world, entirely beyond human control, and as the mustard seed shows us, entirely beyond human expectation. And as the sower tells us, the soil itself has revelatory potential. Well, I want to develop these thoughts further as I turn to the last section of my talk this evening. What does it mean to participate in a spirituality that takes climate care seriously? In my opinion, it means to actualize the messianic hope in the world, because the scriptures show us that the messianic hope is at home in this world. And that follows, I think, from the last section I've just been talking about. If God can be active in the world as it is, we ought to assume that the messianic hope can also be activated as well. Next, please. Now, for that purpose, I'm going to lean on two different resources this evening. The first is a document on climate change that was produced jointly by the Roman Catholic Church and the United Church of Canada, called The Hope Within Us. It was published in 2018, and you can find it pretty easily on the internet. Tonight, however, I'm also, next please, going to appeal to the work of one of the most prominent New Testament scholars active in the world today. He is Anglican bishop and academic N.T. Wright. And in particular, I'll refer to his book, Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection and the Mission of the Church. And it was first published in 2008. All right. As we try to discover a biblical spirituality of climate care, one that affirms the idea that this world is our home, we need to grapple with implications of the messianic hope. Clearly, we in the church have to acknowledge that the messianic hope has not yet been fully realized. And that's, of course, precisely where heavenism can claim some legitimacy. After all, it takes the hope that God has yet to fully restore the universe with utmost seriousness. So is this world really our home? In responding to this question, I think it's important to realize that the church lives between the now and the not yet. And this ambiguity extends to an evaluation of the created order as it now stands. Granted that it has a capacity to manifest the presence of God, as I hope I've shown, the Christian hope perceives that the created order is one that stands still in need of redemption. And that comes across very clearly in a statement made by St. Paul in Romans chapter 8. Quote, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for the redemption of our bodies." Now, according to St. Paul, all of creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. However, Paul implies that one of the reasons the earth is groaning is because it has become frustrated in its ability to realize its God-given vocation because of human sin. In other words, human sinfulness acts to thwart creation's God-given blessing to flourish. Intriguingly, the earth's groaning parallels the groaning of those whom Paul says wait for adoption, for the redemption of our bodies. There's a really interesting convergence of imagery here. The wordless speech of groaning connects the suffering creation with the suffering to live in the Spirit of God. Given the deteriorating state of the environment, to my mind, there are some clear implications for those of us who are called to follow Jesus. as we contemplate the effects of human activity on the animals, on the plants, on the ice sheets, and on the jungles. It's an urgent task to hear the wordless groaning of creation. And with this in mind, a spirituality of climate care might take its cue from the Christian vocation to care for the poor. And I'll say more about this in a minute. After all, the disciples of Christ have always been known for their care of the marginalized and the disadvantaged, those whom Jesus called the least of these. Could the least of these include the environment itself? Next. In this respect, while referring to Romans 8 in his recent encyclical on ecology, Pope Francis has observed that the earth and the poor are so closely linked that, quote, the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail, end of quote. To insist that God is going to abandon the world we now live in ignores the parallels that exist between the groaning of the present order and our inner struggles to live in the spirit of Christ. Paul does not think that the new humanity simply awaits future realization. The groaning of the Spirit means that in Christ, a new humanity is intended to start taking shape here and now. And to that end, what does all creation wait for now but the emergence of a new kind of human being that does not sin against it? The document, The Hope Within Us, reflects a similar kind of reasoning. Next, here we read, some Christians understand these symptoms of climate change as signs of the end of the world, and therefore not something they have a responsibility to address. This is not the eschatology of either the Catholic or the United Church, and I might add the Anglican Church as well. Our churches understand climate change not as a sign of the approaching end of the earth, but as a call to conversion and action. This kind of thinking is given a biblical and exegetical underpinning by the work of New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. As he observes, in general, the early church did not think of the afterlife principally in terms of going to heaven. On the contrary, the first Christians thought primarily in terms of experiencing a new heaven and a new earth. But this did not leave them into paths of world denial or to despise the body in the present created order. Basing himself on the New Testament witness, Wright remarks as follows. Next. Salvation is not going to heaven, but being raised to life in God's new earth and new heaven. But as soon as we put it like this, we realize that the New Testament is full of hints, indications, and downright assertions that this salvation isn't just something we have to wait for in the long, distant future. Next, please. From that perspective, Wright knows, and I think quite correctly, that, and I quote, the transition from the present world to the new one is not a matter of the destruction of the present space-time universe, but of its radical healing. Well, what can these perspectives drawn from contemporary Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant thought mean for a spirituality of climate care? Next. I'm going to answer that question by appealing to the description of Jesus's messianic mission. The Gospel of Luke says that Christ proclaimed the meaning of his own messianic mission at the beginning of his ministry. There we read in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus read the following words from Isaiah and said that they applied to him. Next. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What happens if we gloss Jesus's mission to the poor with the very poverty of the earth itself? We who await the fulfillment of the resurrection hope are to understand from Jesus's own words that its inauguration has already begun. Moreover, the ministry that Christ embarked on anticipated that signs of the Messianic age can and must be manifested in the present created order. Next. In fact, Jesus' self-description of his message dovetails with a theme that has emerged in contemporary Jewish spirituality and reflects his deep roots in the Jewish spirituality of the biblical tradition. And here I refer to a concept that has become quite important in Jewish environmentalism called tikkun olam. Tikkun olam, this is a Hebrew phrase that means to repair the world. The word olam means world, and the noun tikkun is derived from a verb that means to fix or to repair it. When Jesus described his messianic ministry, he as much as said that he had come for the purpose of tikkun olam, to repair the world. How could his followers in this world fail to do otherwise? Such reasoning has direct application to the meaning of the Lord's Prayer, as N.T. Wright observes. Next. Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of God's new project, not to snatch people away from earth to heaven, but to colonize earth with the life of heaven. That, after all, is what the Lord's Prayer is about. So in conclusion, throughout this brief talk, I have wrestled with the quest for a Christian spirituality of climate care. And I suggest that spirituality involves manifesting signs of the messianic hope. It is a commitment to live as disciples of Messiah Jesus in his commitment to repair the world. Since the Messiah has already come into the world, the Christian hope does not simply look forward to a future saving action of God. On the contrary, the question that confronts us in the church is how to live as followers of Jesus in the here and now. As Romans 8 emphasizes, all of creation is groaning as it waits redemption at the hands of those who are filled with the Spirit of Christ. Next. So from this perspective, it has been my thesis that a Christian spirituality of climate care is one that needs to incarnate and advance the messianic hope. If the Messiah has come to repair the world, what should his followers do but the same. Such a spirituality of climate care, in my opinion, faithfully actualizes the words of the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was amazing. I'm wondering if we have any questions coming through, Ian.
There's one question from Mary Brown to everyone. What actions do you suggest?
So Bill, that would be, what actions do you suggest?
I think that at this moment in time, we need to take the mandate of Jesus seriously from Luke chapter 4. We need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight, and let the oppressed go free? And if we're willing to extend those descriptions to the environment itself, to the creatures of this world that we live with and share this world with, then they are ones that need to hear good news. They're ones that need to be released from a captivity of human oppression and pollution. There is an oppression of nature for which it is necessary to proclaim freedom.
Lovely. Any other questions?
I don't see any others in the chat. Mary Robbins is the only one in the chat. So what I may do now at this point is to
I was just gonna, while you do that, Ian, I was just gonna, as you were talking, Bill, I was thinking about those interactions that we have with people that are the heavenism people. And do you have any tips for us? You know, do we try to convince? Do we, live and let live? And
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there are different opinions in the Christian church, and people who are confident in the ideology I've called heavenism certainly have strong opinions. I think that the first thing we need to do is to be persuaded ourselves that there's another way of reading the scriptures, and that we first of all need to be confident that there is another way of reading the tradition, which simply suggests that heavenism misunderstands the messianic hope, and that we have every right to be as confident in our reading of the scriptures and the traditions as those we might encounter with different opinions in the church.
thank you.
I want to point out to people that they can type questions in the chat, or else I can unmute.
Yep. If you're interested in providing a question, you can do so in the chat function in Zoom, or you can just take your microphone off mute, and we would love to hear from you. So it's just a conversation. If you have any questions for Bill.
Bill, Mary Radden here. Is this idea of heavenism a new phenomena in the Christian church, or what is the long tradition been?
Thanks, Mary. I think that this is a really good question. In fact, a tradition of world denial and body denial has a very long history in Western Christianity. It's important to recognize that it's never been completely dominant in Western Christianity. And it's also important to recognize it's never been dominant in Eastern Christianity. This particular perspective on the meaning of the world and our life in the world has been a matter of ongoing debate for centuries.
So you're referring back to the Desert Fathers, early monasticism, that sort of thing?
Yeah, although it's hard to characterize the Desert Fathers as being in one camp or the other, because they were involved in a very important kind of thought experiment. But certainly, I think that when you get to a kind of medieval theology, you find that within the medieval theologians, you have a number of opinions, some of which are much more world affirming than others. And this has always been a struggle in the Christian church.
Hi, Eve. Would you like to ask a question?
Actually, there were two comments that I wanted to make, but one of what can we do about it? As lay readers, we are often entrusted with the prayers of the people. And I think especially now, it's not inappropriate to remember non-human creation. After all, the beginning of John, Christ is the Word through whom all things were created. I think it's very, very difficult to disregard that element of creation and that reason also for revering, having reverence and respect for it, as well as caring for it as having been deprived. So something to pray about.
Thank you for that, Eve. Any other questions? I was just thinking, can you be in both camps?
Yeah, of course you can, because I emphasize there's an ambiguity about the Christian hope, which is, I think, irreducible. I was just thinking farther in relationship to Mary's own question about theologies of world and of denial and affirmation. I place myself very much in a kind of Reformed theology, which has always thought that the Spirit of Christ is capable of transforming the world that we live in into something closer to the kingdom of God. But the fact is, and I said this in my little talk, we are continually living between the now and the not yet. There's a tension here. There's a tension between recognizing how far the world is from the world we think God wants it to be. And there's at the same time, recognition that within this world, there are all kinds of signs of God's presence. Earlier, when I was thinking about this particular talk, I thought I, at one point, would contrast that hymn, "This World Is Not My Home," with that other great popular hymn, "How Great Thou Art," when I see, the wonders of creation and I say, "How great thou art." And I think that we're continually caught between the now and the not yet, between wanting to see the realization of a hope that has not come to pass, and seeing signs and performing signs of that presence in our own lives and in the life of the world. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think that the temptation is always to somehow slice through the ambiguity and want to have a little less ambiguity than we may be comfortable with. And perhaps that's one of the things that the exponents of heavenism want to do. They want to live with a little less ambiguity between the now and the not yet. We can go the other way and also find a way of going through that. But it seems to me the Christian life just lives with that kind of basically unresolved tension.
Mhm.
And we're left with it. We have to ask ourselves, to what extent can we work towards resolving that tension in the present, knowing at the same time that we're also dependent upon the action of God to do something in the future, which we cannot.
I like that saying. Now and not yet, it will be used again. Yes. Do we have any other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. This is Ruth Morrow speaking.
Hi, Ruth.
I just think the Renaissance painting of the birth of Jesus, for me, that clinches it all, because I don't think the church, particularly in the West, has really grasped the incarnation, that Christ was made, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So I would just like to put in a plug, but what we can do is to really pay attention to the incarnated spirit of Christ in small children. And because I think that that's one place where the church has gone astray, because Jesus puts a child in front of us and says, unless you become converted like one of these, you shall in no way enter the kingdom of God. So I just wanted to put that plug in for the value of the littlest in our midst.
Nice, thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth. Not that there's really any relation. Just
Do you want to expand
we're
on that?
married.
Oh, is that right? No, there you go. Any other questions? Had a good turnout tonight. Thank you all for attending. Have a nice cool night to be sitting inside. It's just as nice as the calendar turns. Okay, Bill, do you have any parting words? Anything you'd like to add?
No, all I think that I want to reiterate has been said. If I have any parting words, it's to, again, I think, quote what Pope Francis said in his encyclical, which I think bears a great deal of reflection. And I can find it here in my notes.
I think we- do you have it up there?
The earth and the poor are so closely linked that the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. If you take nothing away from my speech except that particular quote, then I think we have found something valuable. Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." Where is the poor really to be found? In the current environmental crisis and the looming challenges of climate change.
No.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
somber, but true.
Mary, would you like to remind people about Jeremy's talk next week
Yep.
and the fact that all the links are the same Zoom for all?
So next Thursday, we have another speaker in our speaker series. The link in the email that you received is the same link that you can use to jump on to that talk next Thursday and every other Thursday in September and ending on October 7th. Is there anything else, Ian?
And also,
If you can't.
mention that we don't really have a schedule conflict with the election debates of the local leaders, because that's at a different time. It's 2 hours later than ours, so.
Okay, Ian's just pointing out that we do not have a conflict with the election debates, that the debates are later than our session. So we hope that you can join us. Yeah, that's great. Thank you all for attending. It's been a great night. I've really enjoyed this talk, Bill. It was really interesting. I was eyes wide open through the entire talk. I love the way you ended it with Pope Francis' words. So thank you all and hope to see you again next Thursday. Cheers.
Thanks very much.
It's really good.
Oh.